So when does The Simpsons start up again? Disenchantment is an original animated series satirizing the epic fantasy genre, recently debuting its 10-episode first season on Netflix, courtesy Matt Groening, Josh Weinstein, Bill Oakley, David X. Cohen, and a whole bunch of other writers and producers, best known for The Simpsons and Futurama, which additionally reunites a not insignificant chunk of the Futurama voice cast, including Billy West, Joe DiMaggio, Tress MacNeille, David Herman, and Maurice LaMarche, and features animation from the reliable Rough Draft Studios, all of which makes it pretty hard to believe that a prospect seemingly enticing as Futurama but for fantasy wound up on streaming instead of a network. Until you watch it, and then it's not hard to understand at all. I'm honestly hard-pressed to think of a series with this level of pedigree that got off to this bad of a start. Sure, high-concept animated comedies especially are notorious for taking a handful of episodes to coalesce into what they eventually become. Even modern masterworks like The Venture Brothers, BoJack Horseman, Rick and Morty, or even Futurama itself needed a few to get going, but Disenchantment's issues aren't simply an issue of growing pains. It's a series that starts off weak, trite, and lifeless, gradually improves to the point of stale and formulaic, but maybe going somewhere, only to finally go somewhere and leave you saying that was it. Now sure, anyone who was expecting something on the level of Futurama, or The Simpsons for that matter, was bound to be disappointed, but this isn't even in the same stratosphere, though on the other hand, if you were ever feeling deprived of Shrek never getting turned into a weekly show, well, this is pretty much exactly what that might have been in tone and execution. The series is set in a kingdom called Dreamland and nominally centers on the exploits of its teenage princess Tia Beanie, or Bean, voiced by Abby Jacobson from Broad City. And to be clear, Bean is very much Disenchantment's main saving grace and novelty. Granted, deconstructing the princess trope is pretty much the fantasy genre's default operating mode in the 21st century, but Bean is something else regardless. Not just the standard rebellious tomboy, but a sloppy, clumsy, violent, horny, carousing, drunken, drug-binging, aggressively chaotic, hyper-emotional train wreck of a character who's trying harder to be disliked than the entire rest of the series is trying at anything. And the few and far apart moments where her character is allowed to simply be all of that and the action can narrowly focus in on the agreeable spectacle of Sansa Stark but also Bender stumbling and smashing her way through a fantasy kingdom like a one-woman Delta house is the moments where Enchantment kinda works, but they're only just that, moments, and they're crowded out by an entire rest of the show that not only doesn't work, but doesn't fit together on a thematic or character level. Joining Bean in the main cast are Eric Andre as a demon and Nat Faxon as an elf, both of whom are mainly characterized by dark secrets openly advertised as set to pay off in the apparently already guaranteed season 2, getting a little tired of that shit, Netflix, and otherwise feel completely unmoored and unfocused. Elfo, the elf, is meant to be a sweet but naive idiot, sort of driven by a friend-zone crush on Bean, and Luci, the demon, is supposed to be an evil version of Jiminy Cricket, who eggs Bean on to misbehave, which she kind of already does anyway, and if that dynamic sounds off, it really is. In theory, I like the idea of doing a Three Stooges type setup where none of the leads are the straight man, but it takes a lot of work to drive a plot without one of those episode to episode, and Disenchantment seemingly can't be bothered. So instead, Bean, Luci, and Elfo are forced to take turns acting wildly out of character, invariably by dropping the extreme personalities that make them entertaining to begin with, except for Elfo, who's just never entertaining ever, in order to make the storylines happen, which is annoying early on and only gets worse toward the end of the season when you realize the show is going to try and pull the Venture Brothers twist of having all the jokes at the expense of convoluted genre world building turned out to have been actual world building this whole time without ever having earned it. I won't deny that I'm marginally curious to see how the big to-be-continued cliffhanger pays off, but it doesn't excuse the fact that all the unanswered questions left are things that they didn't even bother asking until the season finale itself. What does it in ultimately, though, is a baffling lack of consistency. Well, that and way too many forgettable supporting characters. Just as the main Bean, Luci, Elfo trio is brought down by a lack of a straight man axis to pivot from, there's no fixed point to Disenchantment's satire. Now, not to keep belaboring these two unfair comparisons, but The Simpsons always had American family as idealized by TV sitcoms as its central target above all else. Futurama never forgot what if the future wasn't a dystopia or a utopia, but instead it's just as dreary and pointless as today, being the main joke to go back to, even as it was also mocking every other facet of science fiction. But Disenchantment has no coherent sense of identity from moment to moment. Sometimes it's about Bean as the John Belushi version of a Disney princess mucking up a fairy tale kingdom, but then it also wants Dreamland to do the Monty Python by the way, the Middle Ages were gross and shitty deconstructionist thing, which neuters her impact, which in turn makes the Brothers Grimm by way of George R. R. Martin business feel perfunctory and clunky, and even that comparison only serves to demonstrate how much of a corner the whole thing paints itself into, in that there's a lot of Game of Thrones riffing going on here, but Game of Thrones is itself already a deconstruction of the fantasy genre, almost to the point of being satirical itself in some respects. I mean, highlighting that presenting a fairy tale kingdom interrelations in the fashion of realistic geopolitics, inevitably colored by cutthroat jealousy, lust, and other real-world human foibles, turns the fantasy dark and creepy, is not parodying Game of Thrones, it's just Game of Thrones. Like, that's why Shrek doesn't try to make fun of the Princess Bride. Yeah, it's such a shame too, because there's clearly a lot of talent assembled here, and it must have looked like it had a lot of potential, but even when it gets a laugh here and there, it never really rises above the level of a not especially good webcomic from like a decade ago. 1.5 stars, at least the title is being completely honest.